All right, y'all. So the topic of this video is a very important subject to discuss before we can move forward with our investigation into the medieval time period, which, as I've already stated before, in my opinion, is the most important time period for so-called blacks to grasp what our real role was during this era in history, because it will assist us in understanding a couple of things. Number one, it will help us to understand that our history is not just limited to the convention that we know of as slavery, and that we at one point in time were indeed rulers and were indeed in rulership. And it will also help to establish an understanding of where so-called black people truly come from in regards to our lineage, because oftentimes there is some confusion pertaining to where exactly does the so-called black man and black woman, particularly of the United States of America and even just of the Western Hemisphere in general, comes from. And this ultimately derives from the intentional convolution of history that makes it so that the black man and black woman have no past other than slavery. And this ultimately leads to different groups that are created within the so-called black community that attempt to try and get to the bottom of where our people's origins are and, where we originated from. Like, for example, you have the Kemetic so-called blacks who believe that we all descend from the ancient Egyptians and that the Bible is just a rendition of the ancient Kemetic religion, that all of us in the so-called black community who adhere to the Bible should disavow it and pray only to the ancestors and the Kemetic gods and goddesses. And then you have the quote unquote black Aboriginal community with guys like what's this dude's name? Dan Calloway. Yeah, him. And all the other black Aboriginal believers who, for the most part, believe that we strictly only come from America and that we were and still are the original inhabitants of America, which is correct, by the way, but they kind of only limit our people to just being the Aboriginals of America. And then you have the super militant Afrocentrists who are all about Africa this and Africa that, and Africa is our homeland this and Africa is our homeland that, it's the motherland, etc., etc. But most of them will never return back to Africa to live out there for perpetuity, nor will they ever try and do the necessary research to find out what tribe they allegedly belong to in Africa. So, but you have all these groups, right? That again try to come to a conclusive, definitive answer to the question of where do our people come from? But the answer to the question, of where our people come from actually lies within the same book that most, if not all of these groups disdain, which is the Bible or the scriptures. And the main group of people that knew the connection between, who they were in relation to the people in the scriptures, who we call the quote unquote Israelites, were the medieval Europeans. And so that is why it is essential to understand who the people that inhabited medieval Europe were during this time period, because it will give us an insight into who our real ancestors were and where we truly descend from as a nation of people, which is why I stated earlier that this series on medieval Europe that I'm doing on this channel, and even these series that I have coming on my biblical channel, which I know is taking a while to get started, but just bear with me on that, because I would like to, at the very least, get this medieval European series started before I move on to the series that I have planned to launch my biblical channel with. But this series and those series that are coming on my biblical channel, like I said before in one of my last videos I did on the Byzantine Empire, will have a certain level of synchronicity with one another in regards to how I am going to relate certain civilizations in history to the nation of Israel. And one of them, of course, is going to be the medieval Europeans. But anyway, yes, it is important to understand who the medieval Europeans are, what they looked like, and who their real descendants are to this day. But before we can do that, there is a question that I believe needs to be addressed, and it's a very pertinent question that both so-called blacks who are trying to learn more about the topic of the black medieval Europeans, as well as the Caucasians who are trying to refute the notion of so-called blacks ever being in rulership in Europe or anywhere else in the world in the first place. And that is, what happened to the black Europeans and how did the black nobility get wiped from the history books? These are the questions that I hope I can answer for most. And if some still don't get it or understand it, then that's fine. But by the end of this series, which is going to be kind of extensive, but it's necessary. But by the end of this series, hopefully we'll have a better grasp of how and even why our people lost our presence and rulership during and even after the medieval time period. So let's get into it by first looking at one of the initial causations of so-called black people's population numbers in Europe being diminished by a pretty great margin. This incident was said to have killed anywhere from 30 to 60% of the overall populace of Europe 25 million people in total from the years 1347 to 1351 were killed in this cataclysmic event that we know of today as the bubonic plague, which is more widely known as the Black Plague for most. So we're going to take a look at how this plague was actually spread, because a little bit of a spoiler alert here, but the plague was not actually spread by the original and even conventional understanding of how it was spread, which was by rats. So we're going to take a look at first how it was spread and then who it was spread by, which will give us an understanding of how a certain population in Europe started to become more copious in the aftermath of the Black Plague. So let's take a look at how the Black Plague was spread real quick here. So now we're going to read this entry right here from the History Channel's website to see what a certain relatively new study pertaining to how the spread of the Black Plague happened and who was responsible for its introduction into Europe in the first place. So let's read a little bit of this excerpt right here. So rats have long been blamed for spreading the Black Death around Europe in the 14th century. Specifically, historians have speculated that the fleas on rats are responsible for the estimated 25 million plague deaths between 1347 and 1351. However, a new study suggests that rats weren't the main carriers of fleas and lice that spread the plague. It was humans. Okay, so from what we've read so far in this article, it states that this notion that that I, as well as I'm sure most of the people watching this video right now, have heard over the years and have even been taught in our so-called history classes, that rats were the ones that spread the so-called Black Death or bubonic plague, is not true, and that it was in fact spread by humans. So let's keep that in mind as we move forward, that the Black Plague was indeed spread by humans and not rats. But let's read on. So in a study published in January 2017 in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, researchers simulated Black Death outbreaks in European cities to try and understand how the plague was spread. In their simulations, they looked at three possible models for infection: rats, airborne transmission, and fleas and ticks that humans carry around with them on their bodies and clothes. Okay, so pause real quick. So in this last sentence from this paragraph, it states that they looked at a few different models for how this disease was spread, with one of them being, of course, rats, but one of the other ones was humans who could have possibly carried fleas and ticks that were infected with the disease and were being carried by the humans on either their bodies or clothes. So the operative word that I want you guys to focus on is where it says that the human model showed that humans could have spread the disease through infected ticks and fleas from their bodies. Okay, because that is also going to be that is also going to be essential to remember as we move forward. But let's read the rest of this article before we move on. So in most cities, the model that focused on fleas and ticks on humans was the most accurate model for explaining the spread of the disease. Though it may come as a surprise to most readers, previous studies have backed up these findings. The consensus seems to be that the plague spread too fast for rats to be the culprit carriers. And then it goes on to explain in the next paragraph why the rat theory for the spread of the Black Plague couldn't have been possible, reinforcing that once again, it could not have been rats that spread this plague. And then in the very last paragraph, the researchers that conducted this study even go as far as to say that there is very little historical or archaeological evidence to corroborate that the Black Plague could have or was spread by rats, and that there would be more archaeological evidence of dead rats to back this theory up. So I wanted to read this article to establish that, again, the disease of the Black Plague was not, nor could it have been spread by rats, but it was actually spread by human beings. And in a little bit, we're going to see who those specific human beings were that spread this disease. But let's just read one more article from a reputable source to confirm that this study does indeed hold merit and to receive a little bit more insight about it. So now this is an article from the CNN website. So let's read what it has to say about this study pertaining to the Black Plague. So one of the worst pandemics in human history, the Black Death, along with a string of plague outbreaks that occurred during the 14th and 19th centuries, was spread by human fleas and body lice, a new study suggests. So again, this reaffirms that the Black Plague was indeed spread by humans who were carrying around fleas and body lice. So again, just keep that in mind. But reading on, it says it was previously suggested that rodents whose fleas can also transmit the bacteria behind the plague were the main culprits behind Europe's second pandemic of the disease that saw a string of outbreaks occur in succession. And then let's just skip down a couple of paragraphs to where it says to understand. So to understand the historic outbreak, scientists from the University of Oslo modeled the three transmission routes for the disease: rats, airborne, human fleas and lice using mortality data for 9 outbreaks that span the time period of the second pandemic. Their analysis found that human ectoparasites such as fleas reflected the death trends most accurately. The model outcomes therefore suggest the spread of the plague back then was mainly attributable to human fleas and body lice, according to the study published Monday. Okay, so again, we can see that this study states human fleas and human body lice were the reasons why the Black Death or bubonic plague was spread, not because of rats. Like we just read in the last article, there was very little to no evidence, both historical and archaeological, to suggest that rats were the main cause of the Black Plague, which is largely due to the lack of findings of rat bones of the rats that also allegedly died of the disease that should have been found too. And plus, the disease happened during the seasons of fall and spring, which is not a time that, where rats and fleas are at their most active, which is what would have been needed to have happened in order for the disease to spread as quickly as it was spread. So again, there is no possible way that this disease could have been spread by rats or by fleas that had attached themselves onto the bodies of rats. So the only other logical conclusion of how this disease was spread was through transmission between human beings coming into contact with other human beings. And so what type of human being could have had enough body hair to accumulate body lice that could have transmitted such a disease from one person to another? Well, let's find out what that answer is by first seeing where this disease originated from, so that we can trace the people that carried this disease into the various parts of Europe, and then also into Asia and into North Africa as well. And I want you guys to keep that in mind, that the disease was also spread and heavily impacted the region of North Africa in particular as well. But let's see where this disease originated from. So from the title of this article right here from science.org, it states that ancient DNA traces the Black Death to Russia's Volga region. Okay, the Volga region of Russia is where this article claims the so-called Black Death derives from. But let's just read a little bit of the article to see their reasoning for believing that the Black Plague came from the Volga region. And of course, the Volga region is going to be the main point of emphasis for right now. But let's just read some of this article real quick. So in the 14th century, the Black Death wiped out as much as 60% of the population of Europe, spreading rapidly from the shores of the Black Sea to Central Europe. Although historical records first document its appearance in 1346 CE in the lower Volga region of Russia, researchers didn't know whether the highly virulent strain of Yersinia pestis bacterium that caused the deadly pandemic came from a single source or was introduced to Europe more than once by travelers carrying disease strains of plague from different parts of the ancient world. Now, by analyzing 34 ancient genomes of Y. pestis from the teeth of people buried at 10 sites across Europe from the late 14th to 17th centuries, including a mass grave in Toulouse, France above, researchers at the Max Planck Institute for the Science of Human History in Jena, Germany, have found the earliest known evidence of this pandemic comes from Lashivo in Russia's Volga region. Their researchers found a strain of Y. pestis that was ancestral to all other genomes they studied, differing by one mutation from those that caused the Black Death in Europe. They report today in Nature Communications. And we'll just stop right there with that. But we can see here from this article that this group of researchers were clearly able to find some of the earlier strains of the Black Plague, or the variant of the Black Plague that was prior to the one that was spread all over Europe and various other parts of the world within the Volga region, which is in and around Russia. So the reason why I've been putting so much emphasis on this Volga region as being the place of origin for the Black Plague is because the Volga region is the area in Europe where a certain group of people who were known as the Khazars happened to have come from and established an empire that became known as the Khazarian Empire. Now, I am already aware of the controversy that exists concerning the Khazars and them being the ancestors of a certain group of people that I'm not going to mention by name because the video may get flagged or taken down, and I'm not trying to have that happen. But that topic will be saved for a later date or another day, and I most likely won't be discussing that on YouTube because, again, I'm not trying to have my channel get taken down or any of my videos get taken down. So I'll probably create a Patreon page sometime down the line where I'll address historical topics that are too controversial to discuss here on this platform. But the Khazars, for those of you who don't know, were a group of Turks. Okay, Turks, I've already referenced the Turks in my last video series on the Byzantine Empire, where I talked about the Ottoman Turks and how they were the ones that took down the Byzantine Empire. And if you'll remember, I stated that the Ottoman Turks were so-called Caucasians, right? The vast majority, or I should say a lot, because not every last Turkish tribe was so-called Caucasian, but a lot of the Turkish tribes that existed during the medieval time period were indeed so-called Caucasian. Okay, so just keep that in mind. But the Khazars were a group of Turks that established an empire in between the Caucasus and Volga region in Eastern Europe in and around the 7th century AD to the 10th century AD, when they were taken down and conquered by a man who was a prince of the empire that was established by the so-called Vikings in Russia, known as the Kievan Rus, which is indeed where Russia gets its name from. But this prince was named Svetoslav I of Russia, and he was the father of a man by the name of Prince Vladimir the Great. And like I've told you guys already, the Vikings, or at least a certain portion of the Vikings, were indeed so-called black, and that includes the people of Kievan Rus, who descended from the Varangian Guard, who were mainly comprised of Swedes. And I know what a lot of detractors will try and bring out. They'll try and bring out the statement that was made by Ibn Fadlan, where he describes the Rus as being fair-skinned and tall with red hair and blue eyes, if I'm not mistaken. But all of that will be addressed when I do my series on Russia and the Vikings that were in Russia. Okay, but that description that was given by Ibn Fadlan was actually describing the Slavs, who were subjects to the Scandinavian component of the Kievan Rus, but they were considered to be part of the Kievan Rus by being integrated by Oleg, who was the ruler of Novigrad, along with certain other Finnish tribes, to do exactly what his grandson Svetoslav I was able to do in defeating the Khazars and conquering their empire. But the point is that they were considered to be part of the Rus because of this integration. The word Kievan Rus in and of itself is half Slavic in origin, but yes, again, the Slavs who was being described by Ibn Fadlan, not the Swedish Scandinavians. And the description was actually more consistent with how the Slavs are described when you look them up and see how they were described historically. But again, that will be another video for another day. But just getting back to the Kievan Rus, yes, they were indeed so-called black, and this is evidenced by the son of the man who was able to conquer the Khazars, who was known to history as Vladimir the Great. And so when we look at some of the Russian icons that were made of Vladimir the Great and even two of his sons who were named Boris and Gleb, we can clearly see that they were so-called black men. We can see that in this icon right here that singularly depicts Prince, or even as he was known as Saint Vladimir the Great. And then even this one right here is of Vladimir the Great and both of his sons, who were once again named Boris and Gleb. And then here is an icon of Boris, clearly showing him as a so-called black man. And then here is one of his brother Gleb. Once again, it is clear as day that he was also a so-called black man as well. And then here's another depiction of Boris, showing him as a black man with a clear, distinct afro. And then lastly, here is a depiction of an actual descendant of Vladimir the Great by the name of Mikhail Cherengovsky. And this shows him on his bed talking to a boyar of his, or a nobleman of his, who was named Saint Nikitia. And as we can see in this icon, these two are clearly so-called black men. And again, this prince was a direct male descendant of Vladimir the Great, who was again the son of the man who conquered the Khazars, Svetoslav I. So we get the point, right? The people who conquered this so-called Caucasian tribe of Turks, who were known as the Khazars, were so-called black. And I just wanted to go through this. I just wanted to go through that quick little montage to prove that. But the Kievan Rus and the princes who later became known as the Tsars of Russia will be a topic of discussion for another time. But just getting back to the main subject, which is the Khazars. So yes, the Khazars came from the Volga region, which again is where the so-called Black Plague has been scientifically found out to be one of the first places that it originated at. So now let's take a look at a name that was given to the Khazars by a contemporary scholar of their era, who saw what they looked like in person and was able to encapsulate who they were and what their characteristics were like with this singular name that he gave them. So let's take a look at what that was real quick. Okay, so this is a quote from an excerpt that derives from a chronicle about the life of an Arab saint named Saint Abu of Tbilisi, who did indeed live within the midst of the Khazar Empire's prominence, and he journeyed to Khazaria, which was the name of their empire, which I believe is where he was baptized at. But anyway, the man who created this chronicle, saw the Khazars in real time and came to a certain conclusion about them and their nature based off of what he observed. So now let's read this excerpt right here to see how he chose to describe the Khazars, starting at where it says, "But Nurse entered the land of the north, which lit where is the abode of and dwelling place of the sons of Magog," which for those of you who don't know, Magog was one of the sons of Japheth from the scriptures, who was indeed regarded as the ancestor of the inhabitants of certain areas in Eastern Europe, mainly in and around Russia and Germany. And so this is basically meant to indicate that that the Khazars, like I've already stated, came from Russia. Okay, but just reading on, who are the Khazars? Wild men. Okay, wild men. Remember that word, but wild men, terrible looking, with the nature of beasts. Again, please remember this statement as well. But blood eaters who have no faith except for knowing a God creator. Okay, so we've gotten what we needed from this excerpt, which was seeing that the Khazars, again, a group of so-called Caucasian Turkish peoples, were called wild men. Okay, wild men who, according to this chronicler, also had the nature of beasts that a so-called wild man or wild person would have. So here's where we've reached our destination for what I've been trying to get to thus far in this video, which is that the people who spread the people who spread the Black Plague in Europe, as well as in Asia or the so-called Middle East and North Africa. Again, remember that North Africa was also a victim of this plague, but the people who spread this plague into these areas of the world came from the Volga region, right? Remember, the Volga region is where the plague was said to have originated from, according to the scientific research that we just saw. So the people who came from this region where the plague was said to have come from were called wild men. Okay, now I'm sure this is a term that some of you may have heard of, especially if you study medieval history and lore. And if some of you who are subscribed to Chronicles of Judah 144 on Patreon, who I credit a lot of this portion of my research to, have listened to his videos concerning the topic of the quote-unquote wild men, you'll have heard about this group of people who were known in history as the wild men. Now, the way in which the existence of the wild men are spoken of today is in a more fantastical or mythological way, or in other words, the wild men of the medieval time period are passed off as a group of people that never existed and were just made up figures whose inspiration came from the ancient Greek creature known as the satyr, and it's been credited with being the origin of other more modern mythological creatures like the Bigfoot or even the abominable snowman. So their existence has been deemed as made up by most modern day consensus, but this is one of the main reasons why I cited from this article that the Khazars were called quote-unquote wild men by an eyewitness account who saw them and observed their manners as people. So this establishes that people who exhibited traits that this chronicler states himself were akin to the quote-unquote nature of beasts were called wild men. Okay, so the wild men had to have been real, and people who exhibited the same kind of traits that this chronicler stated the Khazars had, which were bestial in nature, could have and most likely were called wild men as well. And I'll even take it a step further and state that some of these Khazars, when they were conquered and taken down in and around 965 AD by the so-called Black Scandinavian component of the Kievan Rus, migrated into an area where the wild men were most known to be present at, which was the woods, and they resided there until the middle of the 1300s, where we see the first instance of the so-called Black Plague pop up at. And they migrated into the various regions of Europe from Italy to the United Kingdom and began to spread this calamitous disease all over the place through the body lice and fleas. Remember the body lice and fleas from humans were actually how the Black Plague was spread, not by rats. We've already established that. So these Khazars are wild men who came from that area, or who came from the area where the Black Plague originated at, were the main culprits for this disease spreading all throughout medieval Europe. That's the conclusion that we can come to from what we've seen thus far. But on the other hand, the Khazars could not have been the ones that spread the disease, and it could have been a completely different group of people who who were known as wild men that migrated from the outskirts of Europe into the main regions of Europe that spread this disease. But one thing is for certain, there was a group of people called wild men that started to migrate into Europe in and around the 1300s and spread this disease to the peoples of medieval Europe, who were mainly at the time so-called black people, okay? And the evidence of this is when the quote-unquote wild man or man of the woods was dubbed within medieval Europe as a specific reference to these figures. It was created in and around the time period when the Black Plague became prevalent within medieval Europe. But let's just take a look at something real quick to confirm that this was indeed true. Let's read this first initial paragraph that will help us get an understanding of the origins of the word "quote-unquote" wild man and when it originated within medieval Europe, specifically to describe the wild men that migrated into Europe in and around the mid to late 1300s and spread the Black Death to the vast majority of the European population. So let's just read this initial paragraph real quick here. So the wild man, wild men of the woods, or wold woes, or wood woes / wold woes, is a mythological figure and motif that appears in the art and literature of medieval Europe, comparable to the satyr or faun type in classical mythology and to Sylvanus, the Roman god of the woodlands. So again, they're trying to make it seem like the wild man was just a mythological creature that the peoples of medieval Europe created after the image of the satyr or even this Roman god Sylvanus. And although there are similarities to the wild men and a figure like the Roman god Sylvanus, in regards to both of them being associated with the woodlands, we'll see that the wild men are clearly in reference to actual people and not just some made-up entity or quote-unquote god per se, because they were nothing of the sort, and they were regarded as nothing of the sort. There are actually a lot of medieval crests that depict the wild man as a servant to the so-called black nobility of medieval Europe during that time period. And I'll show some of those images in a little bit here, but let's read one more excerpt from this Wikipedia entry to get an idea of the origins of this term wood woes or wold woes. So let's read this real quick here. The normal Middle English term also used to the present day was wood woes or wold woes, also spelled wood house, wood was, etc., understood perhaps as variously singular or plural. Wood woes occurs in Sir Gawain and the Green Knight circa 1390. So again, pay attention to these dates because this medieval story that the entry references, as we can see, was written in 1390. Please keep in mind that the Black Plague started in the year 1347 and culminated into the year of 1351, okay? So the story was written right in and around the time these wood woses or wild men were entering into Europe. But let's read on. So the Middle English word is first attested to in the 1340s, okay? The 1340s, and reference to the wild man popular at the time in decorative art, as in a Latin description of an tapestry of the Great Wardrobe of Edward III, but as a surname it is found as early as 1251 of one Robert de Woodwose. And this is obviously not directly in reference to the wild men, the name that it mentions from 1251. That is talking about somebody's surname. So again, we're just going to focus on the references that are being made to the wild men. So reading the last of this paragraph right here, in reference to an actual legendary or mythological creature, the term is found during the 1380s in Wycliffe's Bible, translating in Latin Pelosi, meaning hairy. Okay, so that right there is a huge indicator of the main physical characteristic of these wild men that caused the Black Plague to happen. Through the excessive body hair that these wild men had, as well as them being residents of the woods, as the name that the medieval Europeans gave them, which meant wild men of the woods, indicates, was how they attained the body lice and fleas that would eventually be spread out into medieval Europe during the mid-1300s. And just going back to the top of this excerpt right here, where it says the Middle English word is first attested to in the 1340s. Again, when did the Black Plague officially begin to spread on a wide scale? The 1340s, right? Specifically 1347. So it's obvious that the wild men made their migration into Europe by then, and at the very least, probably a little bit before the 1340s even, there were sightings of wild men in Europe that prompted the medieval Europeans to create this word wood woes to describe them. I know this Wikipedia entry references an excerpt from a Norwegian book that was written in like the 1250s, where it references a creature that no one could tell if it was a man or a beast, and it states that the creature looked like a man or a human being, that it couldn't be understood, that it couldn't understood human speech, and that it was covered in hair. its entire body was covered in hair. So there had obviously been sightings of the wild man prior to the 1340s, but the presence of the wild man didn't become felt within medieval Europe until in and around the 1340s, which once again is why the Europeans ascribed the name that they gave to them during this time period. And by the way, just before we move on, a lot of the characteristics of the wild man, like the bestial nature that were being described as having, sounds very similar to how the Khazars were described, right? Which is why they too, as we just saw a little bit ago, were referred to as wild men as well. So I believe my theory still stands that the Khazars were indeed at the very least a portion of the wild men that existed in medieval Europe during this time period. But either way, the wild men were real and not a made-up fiction of the imagination that medieval Europeans just concocted out of thin air. But there is more evidence to back up that this is indeed the truth. And in order to understand this piece of evidence that I am about to show, I want you guys to remember something that I've been emphasizing from the very beginning of this video, which is that the Black Plague, although it's mainly known to have affected Europe, did not just occur in Europe. The Black Plague also was prevalent in other areas of the world like Asia or the Middle East, as well as North Africa. North Africa, for those of you who don't know, is the area in Africa where the so-called Moors were said to have derived from. And most of us should know who the Moors were. They were a group of so-called blacks. Yes, the original Moors were blacks, but they were a group of so-called black people that came from North Africa and were eventually able to conquer the parts of Europe that are known as the Iberian Peninsula, which comprises mainly Spain and Portugal. And so since they were from North Africa, they would have also been victims of this incumbent threat of disease that these wild men presented. And this was illustrated in great detail in a German tapestry that was created in and around probably a little bit after the Black Plague had first entered into Europe and North Africa. So let's take a look at this tapestry to see what the wild men were actually a presence that existed. So this is a relatively well-known tapestry, especially to those of us who are in the knowledge about so-called blacks' real history in medieval Europe. And this tapestry is titled Wild Men and Moors. And some brothers I've seen do videos that include this tapestry think that it depicts the so-called blacks of medieval Europe fighting off the wild men who are trying to attack their castle, as we can see here. But in my opinion, this tapestry is actually depicting Moors who are trying to fight off the wild men, just judging by the clothing. Because again, just please keep in mind that the plague did not just migrate into Europe, it also migrated to different parts in the Middle East, as well as North Africa. So this could very well be a tapestry that depicts the Moors defending one of the castles they built in North Africa. They were known as great castle builders no matter where they were, so a lot of castles were built in North Africa by the Moors, but then this could also easily be one of the castles that the Moors had built in one of the areas in Europe, either in Spain or in Portugal, which they had been presiding over at this time, probably a little bit over 500 years by now during the 13 and 1400s. But the point is that once again, this proves the wild men were indeed real. They did in fact make migrations into Europe and or the other areas of the world that the Black Plague was present, and that they were the ones that spread this disease, because it wasn't until migrations like this from the wild men happened that this disease started to become ubiquitous all throughout Europe. We just saw that references directly to the wild men by the medieval Europeans, who saw them start to move in droves since around like the 13th century or 1200s, and even into the 14th century or 1300s, more specifically the 1340s, where the name that the medieval Europeans called them woodwolves or woadwolves started in, and around the same time period the Black Plague began. And even when you look at a lot of the artwork the medieval Europeans created that depicted the wild men, all of those art pieces either come in and around the time period of the Black Plague or a little bit after the Black Plague had ravaged Europe. Like this manuscript depiction of a wild man that was made around the same time of the Black Plague, around 1300 to 1340. And then this one right here that is entitled Wild Men and Pigs, and was made a little bit after the Black Plague in 1420. And then this one right here is a manuscript that shows two wild men supporting the coat of arms of a couple noble families in Europe. Now, I believe I stated earlier that there were a lot of coats of arms that depict the wild men clearly acting as servants to the so-called black nobility that most conventional scholars would try to pass off as quote-unquote Moors heads. And this concept of the quote-unquote Moors head, allegedly, even though they don't really even know this as a fact, but allegedly the concept of the Moors head comes from the quote-unquote cross of Alcaraz as coat of arms, which was a form of heraldry that originated from King Peter I of Aragon in Spain, and his battle shield that had the cross of St. George on it. And his use of this battle shield during the Crusades inspired St. George to descend from heaven and help Peter I defeat the Moors in battle. Or at least as that story goes, that's what happened. And this coat of arms right here is meant to act as a memorial of this event happening. And what's interesting is that this coat of arms is supposedly supposed to be the coat of arms for Peter I of Aragon. And on this coat of arms, we can see that there are 4 heads, all of which are supposed to depict 4 Moorish kings that Peter I had defeated. But there is an art piece that exists depicting Peter I at this event. And in the art piece, as we can see right here, Peter I is depicted as a so-called black man. You see the man sitting down holding the shield. That's supposed to be Peter I of Aragon. And when you take a look at him, he looks almost exactly like the Moors heads that are on his coat of arms. You see that? Here's Peter I right here, and then here is the coat of arms, same features, and almost pretty much the same skin color. They are both of a clear, distinct brown complexion that you would see a so-called black man having. Okay, now in this painting, there are in fact 4 severed heads of Moorish kings, one of which Peter I is holding in his hands. So the quote-unquote Moors heads were present. But when we take a look at this painting again, the 4 black men on the coat of arms resemble Peter I of Aragon, who is clearly depicted as a so-called black man. And also in the painting, Peter I is wearing a crown just like the 4 heads on the cross of Alcaraz coat of arms. But when you look at the heads, they also have sort of a bandana-like headdress on, and that headdress was something that a lot of medieval European rulers and nobles would depict themselves wearing, particularly on their coins, which was meant to be an emulation of how the emperors of Rome would depict themselves on their coins, where they would have the same kind of bandana-like headdress on. So the bandana headdress usually meant European king or ruler. So with all that being said, since none of the other quote-unquote experts can figure out exactly what these quote-unquote Moors heads represent, or at least they'll act like they don't know, but since they allegedly don't know what they're meant to represent, the symbology is completely free for open interpretation. And my interpretation of why these 4 heads of so-called black men on this European coat of arms are present is because they are meant to depict Peter I of Aragon as a so-called black man, because that is what he was, as we can clearly see in this painting. But we'll discuss that more. We'll discuss more about the coat of arms and various other medieval European families later on. But just keep this explanation of the quote-unquote Moors heads in mind for later on. But getting back to the wild men, once again, it is obvious that their presence in Europe came in and around the same time period as the Black Plague, and this coincidentally enough coincides with the time when this disease started to run rampant throughout Europe, killing the vast majority of the medieval European population, which once again was mainly comprised of so-called blacks. So that would mean that the disease primarily affected so-called blacks, or so-called black people, since they didn't have any antibodies for it, due to them not being around the particular environment that the wild men had been around that allowed them to become immune to the Black Plague disease. And there is in fact evidence to back up the assertion that the so-called Black Plague, which could be a double entendre alluding to the fact that the plague primarily affected so-called black people, by the way, but there is scientific evidence that this disease did indeed primarily affect people of color. So let's look at that real quick before I end the first part of this series. Now, when we read the title of this article, we can clearly see that it says black women most likely victims of London's Black Death. So they reveal little hints of truth with articles like this, but then when you scroll down and look at this and other articles that cover this subject, of course they have to inject a little bit of narrative as well, which is why we'll see that they'll state quote unquote black women of African descent were the ones who were affected most by the Black Plague. See, so they have to inject the African part in there to divert from the truth a little bit and make it seem like these were African women that were being killed and not who it really was, which was so-called black women who were part of the regular population of medieval Europe during this time period. But let's examine this for a second here, because again, they are telling the truth. So-called black women and just black people in general were being killed off the most by this disease, but it wasn't for the BS reason that they give in this article, which of course has to do with so-called racism. But it was simply because, as I stated earlier, they did not have the antibodies to fight off this disease that was being spread so rapidly across Europe, whether it was a peasant, so-called black woman, or person in general or someone of nobility, the so-called black population in Europe could not fight off this disease. And the evidence of this is when we look at some of the black ruling elite during that time period who died of this disease. Now, all of the nobility figures that I'm about to show you guys are portrayed as Caucasians in the mainstream. There should be no surprise about that. But when we look at the lineage of some of the most notable medieval European deaths, like that of Joan of England, daughter to King Edward III of England, and his wife Philippa of Hainault, we can clearly see that she was indeed a so-called black woman who died of the Black Plague, just like this article states was the main demographic that were most affected by this disease. But she was not so-called African. She was a black woman of nobility who once again was born to King Edward III and Queen Philippa of Hainault. But let's see that this is indeed true. So this is a manuscript that depicts King Edward III with a sword in his hand and knight armor on. And this manuscript image of Edward III is clear as day about what his true appearance was. You probably can't see the facial features of Edward III that well because his face and the skin complexion that the chronicler gave him is so dark that it blends in with the sort of blackish armor that Edward III is depicted having in this image. So this obviously shows Edward III as a so-called black man, which is exactly what he was. But I know I'll see in the comments from people in denial, oh, his face just got dark because the manuscript darkened over time due to age. But notice how no other element in this manuscript has grown darker. All of the original colors still seem to be pretty much intact, or still intact. And as a matter of fact, you can make a better case that the paint in this image has actually been chipped off a little bit. And you can see that by the little white spots that have developed over time, but it certainly hasn't been quote unquote darkened over time. When you take a look at Edward III's beard, it is still completely white. It has no signs of darkening at all whatsoever. And of course, his beard is attached to his face, right? So how could the rest of his face grow darker over time except his beard, which once again is attached to his face? So it should be obvious that this was originally how Edward III was depicted in this manuscript, as a so-called black man. But let's look at one more depiction of Edward III to confirm that this was indeed true. So this statue is from the cathedral in York Minster, England, and it's what's called a quote unquote choir scene in the York Minster Cathedral. And on the so-called choir scene, it shows a series of statues of pretty much every medieval English king from William the Conqueror, the first Norman king of England, who established the royal seed line that stretched all the way to King James's dynasty, but from him to one of the last, what was called Plantagenet kings in Henry VI, is who was depicted on these statues. And please keep in mind that these statues were originally commissioned to be built by a member of the Plantagenet dynasty, King Henry V of England, who was a direct descendant of Edward III through Edward's son, John of Gaunt. But the statues were not completed during the life of Henry V, but they were finished during the reign of Henry V's son, King Henry VI of England. So these statues were essentially commissioned to be made by the family members of King Edward III, who would have known how he was originally portrayed, even though they lived and ruled England some 100 years after Edward III was King of England. But anyway, when we take a look at this statue right here, you can see that Edward III is portrayed to have tight, curly, coily hair that looks to be in the shape of an afro. You guys see that right there? The tight curls that King Edward III is portrayed having here in this image. Here is the statue from another angle, and from this angle we can see both Edward III and his grandson, King Richard II, who by the way was the grandson of Edward III by way of King Edward III's son, who was known as Edward the Black Prince. Now, I'm not going to go too deep into that name that was given to Edward III's son right now, because that will be saved for a later date when I talk about the Plantagenet dynasty in England. But as we can see here, both Edward III and Richard II's hair, and Richard II, by the way, was the grandfather of Henry V and the great-grandfather of Henry VI. So again, Henry V being the commissioner of the statue being made, and his son being the one who had the statues finished by hiring, I believe the guy's name was William Henley, to finish them. That gives how these men were portrayed in these statues a level of authenticity in regards to how they were portrayed. And once again, when we look at really both of these statues, it should be obvious that both of these men have tight, curly, coily hair that is in the shape of an afro. You see the tight curls, especially in Richard II's hair. You can see it very clearly, clear as day, that those are tight, curly, coiled haired afros. And you guys can go and look up these images yourself. They're called the York Minster choir scene statues of kings. And you'll see that pretty much every king from William I on down, for the most part, has this tight, curly, coily hair, which indicates that these men were indeed so-called black men. You can even see, if you feel inclined to do so, you can take a look at how other fake statues that weren't authentically made during the medieval time period, like these choir scene statues were, portray these kings' hair as long, straight / wavy hair going down their shoulders and stuff. And don't get me wrong, the concept of the so-called black men having a perm or straightening their hair was still going on back then, just like it does today with so-called blacks. But this is what their hair really looked like right here. And again, this is how Henry V and his son Henry VI chose to have their family members portrayed. This is what they commissioned to be built. So I'm not making up any of this at all whatsoever. And again, you guys can go and take a look at these things for yourself if you want to see that I am not lying. And this image of Edward III reminds me of one last portrayal of Edward III that I can think of, which shows him clothed in the robes of the knight order that he and his son Edward the Black Prince established, which is known today as the Order of the Garter. And in this manuscript image of Edward III as a Knight of the Garter, you can see that the face has been whitenized a little bit, but the brown or dark coloring in his face is still clearly visible, just like it was in the last manuscript image that I showed of him, where he was clearly originally painted having dark skin. But when you look under his crown, you can see the same tight curly haired afro hairstyle that he had in the statue, and the hair is going out like an afro. It's not straight or going down to his shoulders like how most modern depictions like this one show his hair to have been. So it should be pretty clear now, right? Edward III, who was the father of the main subject that we're focusing on right now, Joan of England, was indeed a so-called black man, which would in turn make her a black woman, right? Which would mean that she had to have been one of the black women that fell victim to the Black Plague, like in the article we just read from, that stated black women were more likely to be victims of the Black Plague while it was running rampant throughout Europe. But Joan of England was not a quote-unquote African black woman who was a slave. She was a woman of nobility who became the Queen of Sicily. But just in case this isn't proof enough that Joan of England was indeed a black woman, let's read a description of her mother, Queen Philippa of Hainault, real quick here. All right, so let's briefly read this description of Philippa of Hainault to see what she looked like. And this description comes from a bishop who lived during Philippa's life and saw her in person. So let's read this real quick. So starting with the lady. So the lady whom we saw has not uncomely hair, betwixt blue and black and brown. Her head is clean shaped, her forehead high and broad and standing somewhat forward. Her eyes are blackish brown and deep. Her nose is fairly smooth and even save broad at the tip and also flattened. Okay, so pay attention to that. Yet it is no snub nose. Her nostrils are also broad, her mouth fairly wide, her lips rather full. So remember those facial features as we go down a little bit in this description here to see what the color of her skin was said to be. So starting where it says moreover. So moreover, she is brown of skin all over and like her father. Okay, so Philippa of Hainault is one of the more obvious so-called black women in medieval European history, which is why even in relatively mainstream historical narrative, it has been supposed that she has quote-unquote Moorish ancestry. And it's because of how undeniable this description is of her being a so-called black woman. The description states that her nose was flat and broad, and her lips were described as full. Okay, and then her skin is described as being brown all over, right? So that undeniably sounds like a so-called black woman, which is exactly what Philippa of Hainault was. So again, just going back to the daughter that Queen Philippa had with Edward III, who was Joan of England, it's clear that both of her parents were described and portrayed by contemporaries as well as literal family members of theirs as being people of color or so-called black people, which in turn would make Joan of England herself a black woman, but not just a black woman. She was a black woman that was a victim, or that was the victim of the Black Plague, like what I just what I just read. We just read that black women were the main victims of the Black Plague, right? And as I was able to show, Joan of England had to have been a so-called black woman as well. So it's clear that this plague affected the black nobility of medieval Europe, along with the population of Europe that was mainly comprised of so-called blacks, which is one of the main ways that they lost their preeminence as being the dominant factor in Europe, but also their rulership. And another example of so-called black medieval European nobility figure who died of the Black Death was actually someone else who came from the same family as Joan of England. As a matter of fact, this person was her niece, by way of her brother John of Gaunt, who was also a son of King Edward III and Philippa of Hainault, and even the brother of Edward the Black Prince. So it's obvious that he also had to have been a so-called black man himself, which would make his daughter, who was named Philippa of Lancaster, a black woman as well. So here we have yet another so-called black woman who was a nobility figure that died of the Black Plague, again confirming that the so-called black women who died of the Black Plague were not African women, or if there were African women that actually came from Africa and died of the plague, because that is possible. But the so-called black women who died of the Black Plague also included the black women who were of the noble classes in Europe as well. But I'm going to show a couple more examples of black nobility figures who died of the Black Plague, and then we'll wrap this video up. So another nobility figure in medieval Europe who died of the Black Plague was a noble woman by the name of Anne of Bohemia, who actually became the Queen of England next to Richard II of England, who I already mentioned and showed earlier. But Anne was the daughter of Charles IV of the Holy Roman Empire, who himself was described by an eyewitness account as being a man of color, as well as being depicted as one as well. But let's just take a look at a couple of these depictions and descriptions of Charles IV to prove that Anne was indeed a so-called black woman. So this is an excerpt from an article written in the early 1900s that cites a description of Charles IV from the Holy Roman Empire by an Italian historian named Matteo Villani, who saw Charles IV in person. So now let's read what he has to say concerning the appearance of Charles IV. So we'll start where it says the chronicler. So the chronicler was Matteo Villani of Florence, who says that the emperor was a swarthy little man, broad-faced, black-bearded, and rather bald in the front. And let's just stop right there. So we see here that Charles IV of the Holy Roman Empire was called a swarthy little man. And I've already gone over what that term swarthy meant back during the medieval time period and a little bit before. It was just another word to describe a person of color, or what we would call today a so-called black person. And you can go and check out the more in-depth presentation I did on the word swarthy in my last video series is on the Byzantine Empire, because we'll see that word more and more moving forward. But there are other depictions of Charles IV of the Holy Roman Empire that depict him having this swarthy skin complexion, like this one right here that shows him as having that dark or quote unquote swarthy skin that he was described as having by a contemporary source that saw him in person. This is what the word swarthy meant back during the medieval time period, okay? But let's look at one more image of Charles IV real quick. Here it is right here. This was a bust that was made during the time period of Charles IV's reign. And from this bust, we can see that there are, clear and distinct so-called black features here, especially, with the nose. The nose is of a so-called black man. And I will put far more context into the images and the descriptions that I show of these people when I, get to the actual series that I'm going to do, or that I'm going to be doing on these medieval dynasties. But I'm just showing these images real quick right now for you guys to see that these people were indeed so-called black, to get my point across. But Anne of Bohemia is yet another example of a so-called black woman of nobility that succumbed to the Black Plague, and I believe even her sister Margaret of Bohemia also died of the Black Plague as well. So that is yet another example right there. But let's just take a look at one last nobility figure who died of the Black Plague to end this video off and to close out this investigation into how so-called blacks lost their rulership in Europe. So let's take a look at a male nobility figure at this time who lost their life to the Black Plague. And this figure was known as Louis I of Naples, who was a descendant of a man who established the rulership in Naples by the royal French house of Anjou, which I will go over when I talk about the medieval rulers of France and the Plantagenets. But anyway, Louis I was a descendant of Charles I of Anjou. So now let's see how Charles I of Anjou was described to get an idea of what Louis I of Naples looked like. So let's read this excerpt right here to see how Charles I of Anjou was described. And once again, this is another quote from the same man who described Charles IV of the Holy Roman Empire, Matteo Villani. So let's read what he has to say, starting with this brother. So this brother of St. Louis, this Charles of Anjou, of whom his admirer Villani has left so fearful a portrait. This black man who slept little. So that was describing Charles I of Anjou right there. He was literally described as a black man. Now, some people might state that the term black in that sentence was meant to be more metaphorical or symbolic in some way. But please keep in mind that there are some translations that also translate the word black as dark, i.e. he was a man of very dark skin complexion, and he was known to be of a dark skin complexion according to scholars. So now let's take a look at how one of these scholars described Charles I of Anjou. So now this is a book that talks about some of the stories that were written by one of the greatest medieval poets ever, Dante Alighieri. And this will provide us with the context we need concerning Charles I of Anjou and what he looked like. So we'll start where it says he was tall and strong. So he was tall and strong in frame, fierce and frowning of countenance, with a large prominent nose, and dark-skinned almost as a Moor. So according to this scholar, Charles I of Anjou was known to be dark-skinned, close to that of a Moor. And I've gone over the term Moor and how it was literally meant to act as a synonym for a Negro or a so-called black person during the Middle Ages, right? And as we just read, Charles I of Anjou was described as a black man, or even a dark man, i.e. a dark-skinned man, by somebody who lived in and around the time period of Charles I's life and reign. So this obviously should indicate to us that Charles I of Anjou had to have been a so-called black man, which will make his direct descendant, who again was another victim of the Black Plague and its rampant spread all throughout Europe, Louis I of Naples, a black man as well. So we should get the point by now. A lot of the nobility of Europe during the time period of the Black Death's presence in Europe were the victims of this calamitous disease. And with that, I give you the first way the so-called black man and black woman lost their rulership in medieval Europe. So in my next video, we're going to take a look at a little bit farther down the line in history, post Black Plague, and I will go over the conflicts and wars that sprung forth from the various religious upheavals that were caused by things like the introduction of the Protestant movement, or the Protestant Reformation, led of course by the famous reformer himself, Martin Luther. And we'll see how those wars tore apart so-called black people's presence and rulership as well in Europe.